So I am going to talk to you about urban simulation and visualization. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Berkeley. But I've collaborated with computer scientists for a couple of decades now on trying to develop computational methods to model cities and to use those computational methods to improve planning practice. So I'm going to, yes? Yes, can we turn these lights? Yeah, thank you. If you can find that, that would be great. So I'll start with just a bit of motivation for why data science might be relevant and valuable toolkit to think about tackling significant problems in cities. And I think we're finding that computer scientists and people involved in data mining and knowledge discovery are turning their attention towards cities. Is that as good as it's going to get?
It doesn't work for the camera. We tried this in the other room.
I see.
There has to be bright lights for the camera.
All right. Well, unfortunately, that means people won't be able to see the screen very well. It's either for the people in the room or for the people that might watch the video at some point in the future. It'd be nice to favor the people in the room.
It's not my call. It's just it doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for the record.
All right. These are the people that are probably most likely to see this. So. All right. Well, I would encourage people to move up maybe a little bit closer to, be able to see a bit better. It's not as much distance as it is just the brightness. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. Okay, you can hear me better. All right. Besides, moving around got people awake a little bit more. All right, so we'll continue. So I think there are any number of different problems that might motivate people to study cities and to turn their attention and some of the computational techniques that this conference has been focusing on. And I just highlight some of the problems here, which are different in different parts of the world. In the United States and Europe, some of the problems we're concerned with are urban sprawl and greenhouse gas emissions. We have some regions that are in decline instead of growing quickly, aging and so forth. But climate change is creating a tremendous amount of concern. Issues like housing affordability in other parts, such as California and some eastern coast cities as well. Whereas in the global south, let's say more generally, we're dealing with very rapid urbanization. We're dealing with rural to urban migration shifts, informal settlements, environmental degradation, insecurity of infrastructure and so forth. Very, very different kinds of problems and very different kinds of data available to study these cities and improve their outcomes. And I think those are also interesting opportunities for people that work in this space to make some interesting contributions to tackling really important problems. So I'm going to focus my talk mainly on a set of techniques around urban simulation and a little bit of discussion and visualization and why that's relevant in the context of the Bay Area, where you're situated today, and the regional planning process to try to make this region more sustainable. There are state laws that have been passed in California that make it at the forefront of states across the United States that are trying to curb greenhouse gas emissions and really address climate change concerns. And those policies and now legislation seek to change long-term trends in greenhouse gas emissions that have been climbing for quite a while and sharply turn that trend to curtail the increase in greenhouse gas emissions and return it to levels that are historically much lower. Now, most people, when they look at trends like this and they see a proposed change in a trend that has this much discontinuity, would get a little bit nervous. Those kinds of trends are monotonically increasing over decades, and to reverse them in this way is a huge challenge. It's going to require a tremendous amount of technology, a tremendous tremendous amount of coordination of policies to try to accomplish that. Another way I would put it is it really requires a bit of a paradigm shift. Much of the policy and planning that has been used to decide where we build our infrastructure and what kind of infrastructure we build has been focused around a concept called level of service. As how efficiently is the infrastructure working? How fast are the cars moving on the freeway? And this logic will get you into a bit of a conundrum. If you see that the highways are congested and you measure that the level of service is C or D, it's keeping traffic bogged down. A typical kind of linear approach to solving the problem is you simply solve the bottleneck, right? You relieve the congestion point, you widen the highway, you extend the highway to new places, and now you've relieved the traffic. But I think what we've come to understand much better through a lot of research into this is that that linear thinking isn't adequate. There are feedback loops that need to be taken into consideration. So when you widen highways to relieve congestion, it changes people's decision making, right? So instead of traveling on the bus, you might decide to get back in your car. Instead of driving before the AM peak or after the AM peak, you might decide, it's gotten better now, I'll drive in the morning peak. So people change their behavior as a consequence, not only in the short term, but also in the long term. You build a lot more highway infrastructure, and developers can start building on less expensive land further away, and therefore over a longer period of time you start to see housing in a more suburban environment or exurban environment with people taking advantage of the infrastructure to come in. And lo and behold, before long, the induced demand, the feedback loop, begins to congest the freeways again, right? So linear thinking about infrastructure and about cities is going to tend to be fairly short-sighted if it doesn't take into account feedback loops and cause and effect chains that are much more complex. So what's beginning to happen is a shift in the paradigm of planning from simply level of service orientation around mobility, moving people efficiently, looking at it from an infrastructure perspective, to focusing much more on the individuals and how easy it is for them to have access to the opportunities they want to engage in. And that doesn't necessarily mean moving fast, right? The picture on the right is a high accessibility context. This happens to be central Paris, where people are walking and enjoying restaurants and shops. Of course, a good number of them are tourists, but a lot of them are locals as well. And in this context, accessibility is very high, but it doesn't require fast movement, right? So there's a bit of a paradigm shift to focus more on accessibility than simply on level of service. And California policies have begun to reflect this and to actually discount level of service, that is efficiency of movement, towards more important sustainable goals of reducing vehicle miles traveled and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. All right. So the planning processes here in the San Francisco Bay Area have culminated in the development of a plan over the last few years that is also very ambitious. It attempts to concentrate 80% of the new housing over the next 30 years in priority development areas, these magenta areas shown on the map, that reflect only 5% of the land area. And these are areas where transit service is high and more transit service is planned, with the intention of trying to create denser nodal development patterns where people can use transit, can walk, can bike, and don't have to rely on making long trips by automobile that create the bulk of our transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions. But again, just like that graph that I showed of greenhouse gas emissions going up and the goals going sharply down, this is a high degree of concentration that's not necessarily consistent with our historical patterns. There's a long-term history here of development in not only the Bay Area, but out into the Central Valley. And I think you can see that represents something that's far less concentrated than 80% of the development happening in 5% of the land area. So these are the trends over time. we tend to develop at a low density pattern, and that leads to the sorts of infrastructure investments and congestion patterns that we experience routinely. So how do we change those things? How do we change broad patterns of urban development in ways that are more sustainable, given the long history of development patterns that are low density and investment decisions that promote that or support it? This is where computational methods and computer modeling start to play a potential role in the process. So I'm going to talk about Urban Sim, which is an urban simulation model or model platform. It's open source. It's been funded mainly by the National Science Foundation, and now it's become very rapidly almost a de facto standard in terms of regional planning agencies that are trying to do long-term regional transportation plans and understand the feedback effects between transportation infrastructure and urban development. These are some of the places, this is not up to date, but some of the places in the United States that are using it for their operational planning, including the Bay Area. And these are some of the places that have downloaded and used Urban Sim as an open source library in various parts of the world, over 70 countries when I last checked it, but quite some time ago. So let me describe the model system a little bit. This is going to seem rather different than techniques in machine learning and data mining, but I'm going to hopefully entertain some discussion about how the kind of structural modeling that I'm describing here could be informed by and could be hybridized with data mining and machine learning methods. But the core of the idea in the simulation model is that we have to think about cities as systems. We have to understand the agents in these systems and the decisions they make and how they relate to each other. And so I'm highlighting in this diagram some key agents and processes, if you will, that involve interaction of agents in cities. And I'm going to focus on households and businesses that are making location choices. So they're looking for places, households are looking for places to live where the amenities are good, the housing is of good quality, it meets their requirements in terms of family circumstances and so forth. The neighborhood has good amenities, and they are accessible to the things they need to be involved in: workplace, schools, shopping, and other sorts of support activities. Businesses are trying to locate in places that are advantageous to them in terms of accessibility to workforce, to customers, to suppliers and other businesses that they do, that they have relationships with. So these involve demands for real estate in different locations. And when areas are sought after by households of particular types, because they have good access, for example, what we find is that those households, as you might expect from intuition, bid up the prices of real estate in those areas that have good amenities, good accessibility. So this filters its way through the real estate market in terms of influencing prices just through demand and supply relationships. Land is scarce, and land with particular attributes is essentially advantaged in the market system. Real estate developers are, of course, providing new supply or redeveloping existing real estate. And all of this is heavily managed by local governments. In some places more than others. I was in Singapore recently, as you mentioned, and the land is owned by the government, and long-term leases are used to release land for development. In the United States and Europe and much of the rest of the world, it's private ownership of land and a very different kind of real estate market. But governments still, even in places like the United States, which are much more market-oriented, these are very heavily regulated markets. Where we put our infrastructure, how local governments zone the use of land is very heavily managed, and in some places more than others. Oregon, Washington, California, much more so, say, than Texas or Arizona. But nonetheless, these are very influential actors in the urban system, and we're trying to capture the behavior and choices of households and firms and developers in response to different governmental policies. So that's the overall framework that we're trying to reflect here. In terms of mapping that kind of overview of what we're trying to do into models, these are the kinds of models of agents that we're translating that into. And I'll focus more on long-term choices of households here and long-term choices of businesses on the right side, and the choices of real estate developers to build new infrastructure. And what we're trying to do is create a decision support platform, essentially, that allows us to experiment with different combinations of land use plans and transportation policies and explore their effects by running the simulation with alternative assumptions. So all of this is on GitHub. It's in the Urban Data Science Toolkit, UDST, on GitHub. I encourage you to browse what's there and ideally contribute to it in one way or another if you find this interesting. So I'll get into the weeds a little bit. Not too much math in this talk. It's too early in the morning, and I'm not awake enough to be able to do a lot of math anyway. But the kind of models that are embedded here are maybe the closest thing that might relate to most of you would be, say, a recommender system, where you're looking at patterns of choices that people make by looking at transactions on a website and recommending something that might be attractive to that consumer based on their previous searches and criteria. What we're looking at here is something that's generally based on much smaller samples of data, not massive amounts of data, unfortunately. But we observe people's location choices, or we observe their transportation choices. And we construct a statistical model out of that, a discrete choice model, in which we look at the characteristics of the chooser and the characteristics of the alternatives that are available to them and identify which choice they made out of the choice set that was available to them, and estimate the parameters, learn the parameters of the model in a way that lets us generate a probabilistic distribution over the alternatives given the attributes of the chooser and the attributes of the alternative. And once we've estimated these models, we can use them in simulation mode and aggregate across all the individuals to get aggregate prediction patterns that we can then compare to observed data and evaluate how well the model is working. So we do model evaluation in a number of ways. One of them is simply sensitivity analysis. A discrete choice model like that uses an implicit concept of utility or attractiveness of one alternative versus others. When we estimate these parameters, we can perturb the model by changing one parameter at a time, holding the others at their mean values, and explore the sensitivity of the results to each input. We can also do things like compare observed data in the aggregate to our predictions aggregated up from individuals and look at how that compares to other modeling approaches. So in this particular diagram set that we're looking at in this slide, we're comparing the predictions from an individual model of workers at a residence location choosing a job at a workplace location, so long-term location choice of households choosing workplace, comparing that to simpler aggregate models that have been used operationally in transportation planning using a simplified gravity model framework. And we find that we can reduce the root mean squared error by approximately half by using an individual level model and aggregating its results up compared to using an aggregate model. You may not encounter this kind of critique, but I certainly have over the years. In using very detailed data in microscopic simulation, there's a kind of implicit assumption among many people in the modeling community that aggregate data is somehow better, safer, likely to give you better predictions, and so forth. And I think gradually we've chipped away at that, I think, myth at this point to indicate that and to document that actually we can get much more fine-grained and sensitive models using microdata and more realistic aggregate predictions from those models as well. Another way that we validate models like this is longitudinally. So once we estimate all the model parameters and put them together and put the ensemble of models in the system together, we can simulate from one point of time in the past to another point of time later, still in the past, but that we can observe the outcomes at that point. It's quite challenging because it requires building historical data as well as more recent data. And when we do that, we can find patterns like this that we're, with varying degrees of spatial averaging, we're getting correlations that are from 0.8 to 0.9 between observed and predicted values over a 15-year simulation period in this particular case. This is a different view of that, looking at the changes, not just the static result set at the end of the 15-year simulation. And this shows more variability, but it also shows that, at least in terms of households, we're getting a normal distribution of results and centered around 0. In terms of employment, in this particular case, we're finding that it's a bit fatter tails in the distribution here, a little more over-prediction and under-prediction. And in this particular context, we were looking at a relatively small metropolitan area, Eugene Springfield, that happened to have a paper mill plant that shut down and a very large retail mall that opened that we didn't predict exactly. And those widened the tails of the distribution. In some other work that I've done with statisticians, we've tried to tackle the question of how do we analyze uncertainty in model systems like this. Certainly the input parameters are not completely known. There must be some error distribution around them. Input data is not in the same way also completely known. There's uncertainty around that. And so we worked on a methodology, or adapted a methodology that had been used, developed by Adrian Raftery at the University of Washington and used for deterministic models previously. We adapted it to these stochastic models. And what that allows us to do is essentially take random draws from the input space, parameters and data, run a simulation with a particular draw, compare the predicted values of that simulation run to observed data, and assign a weight to that particular draw of the uncertain inputs based on the proximity of the data that's predicted to the observed data. And then repeat that process many, many times to create then a calibration of the uncertainty in the model system. So the goal is to be able to run the model into the future and run it many times and create a distribution of results with some confidence interval around those results. And so we're, I think, making good progress on doing that kind of thing. Just very briefly, I'll digress on the software stack. We're using the scientific Python data stack here. It's being used very heavily at Berkeley in data science. Fernando Perez is at Berkeley and really the pioneer of the IPython toolkit. And anyway, these are very easy to learn, very easy to teach. I teach a course, a graduate course called Urban Informatics and Visualization, in which I bring planning students reluctantly into the computational world and teach them programming and visualization, web scraping, web mapping, and things like that. And I think increasingly we're finding a good appetite for those sorts of things. It is pretty data hungry. Whether it's big data or not depends on your lexicon and what you think big is. It's certainly messy data. I'll qualify it that way. It's large and messy. Whether it's big data is up to you. We fuse together all kinds of data. We're taking information from tax assessors on the individual parcels and buildings in a metropolitan region. We're taking the OpenStreetMap data. We're taking digital orthophotography, sales transactions. We've also done things like scrape Craigslist rental listings to get rental transactions from across the country. Zoning data is particularly challenging because it's embedded in so many different obscure documents in cities. General plans, plan developments, inventories of business establishments, which can come from unemployment insurance records or they can come from commercial data sources. and then census data that we fuse together in a synthetic way to synthesize a microsimulation population. And so we put all that data together, and what we do with it is not what you might typically see in a geographic information system where you have layers of data and you can overlay them and view their relationships in a visual way and maybe do some topological integration that way. We actually tie it together as an integrated graph of the metropolis. So we have essentially a crosswalk between households and businesses and the buildings they occupy and the parcels those buildings are on, and then how those parcels are connected to adjacent parcels, to the neighborhood, to the street network, and the transit system. And then we can query that data very, very rapidly, interactively. So we do accessibility calculations like this. This is a couple of diagrams showing recent work that one of my students has done to take Google Transit Feed Service data, or Generalized Transit Feed Service data now, GTFS, and fuse it with the OpenStreetMap data to create a time-dependent graph of the city to be able to interrogate from any particular location what is your accessibility to employment or shopping or other activities at different times of the day. And so this is showing at the AM peak how many jobs you could reach by walking and transit, including transfer time, including walk to transit and walk from transit. You can see the visual patterns on the right for the San Francisco Bay Area. It looks radically different in the late evening, for example, than it does during the day, given changes in transit service over the course of the day. So what we can do with this, how many of you have used or seen WalkScore? Only a couple of people? If you've been to a website to search for real estate like Redfin or Zillow, you'll often see that one of the things you can find when you type in an address or you're looking at a listing is the WalkScore. It's basically just a scaled number between 0 and 100, where 100 is likely to be in the financial district of San Francisco. It's, you know, a lot of things are within an easy walk, shops, restaurants, bars, whatever things you might be interested in for entertainment and daily activity. But that particular calculation, which turns out to be actually quite correlated with property values, people are willing to pay more for places that are more walkable. That particular calculation is pre-weighted by the people that compute the WalkScore. So what we've done is created an open source alternative to it that is something that we can just has an API, and you can pass various arguments to it to compute what kinds of point of interest data do you want to use as your destination. Do you want to do a statistical calculation on the data you're reaching, like sum or average or standard deviation? And how do you discount the distance along the network from the source? So we find that those kinds of tools can be, I think, quite valuable in planning activities. So turning our attention back to the planning process here, the way UrbanSim was used is it was combined with an advanced activity-based transportation model to enable the evaluation jointly of scenarios that involve different transportation plans with different land use policies. And these are some of the inputs to the model system as scenarios, policy scenarios. On the transportation side, different transit investments, transit stops, level of service, new rail stops, as well as new bus routes. Roadway investments, including general purpose lanes, high occupancy vehicle lanes, high occupancy toll lanes, bike and pedestrian facilities, and then different kinds of pricing policies. If you've come across any of the bridges, you've paid tolls. Increasingly, we're looking at strategies that are price sensitive based on the level of congestion. So it's more demand responsive in the way that you pay peak period pricing for phone service or other things, electricity. On the land use side, we're looking at a variety of local government tools, from comprehensive plans to policies promoting transit-oriented development, subsidies and impact fees to try to capture the external costs of development, urban growth boundaries to try to protect open space, and other sorts of sensitive land protection. And what the model system then predicts is a set of outcomes over time of the evolution of a city in terms of where the people in it live, people of different types, households of different incomes and household structure, businesses of different types, what kind of clustering we get from that, and then travel behavior and outcomes like greenhouse gas emissions. So again, this is just a quick snapshot of the Bay Area. We're dealing with a couple of million parcels from 9 different counties. It's messy stuff. It's not maybe a very big number, but getting this data fused together and internally consistent enough is not an easy thing to do. And this is some of the network data, including the transit network, street network, and walk network. So once the model system is built and calibrated, it's used in a what-if kind of process. That is, assembling policy scenarios with different inputs and then simulating the results. These are some of the policy geographies that were used heavily in this plan. And it includes these priority development areas that I've talked about a little bit earlier, and transit priority areas that were designated by state law based on frequency and quality of transit service. So what do you do with all this output? The model's making a bunch of predictions. We can validate how well it's predicting, but how does that influence any decision making? What the regional agencies have done is coalesce attention around 10 or so indicators that they want to use to guide policy decision making in the region. And it's a triple bottom line, if you've heard that term, triple bottom line framework that tries to focus on not only economic outcomes such as GDP, but also environmental outcomes like greenhouse gas emissions and various kinds of equity outcomes. Housing affordability, for example, is a huge problem here in California. So for each of those benchmarks, or for each of those indicators, a specific goal or benchmark was set. So you see this goal column here. And this is an incomplete list. I'm just trying to give you a sense of it. And then the model system was used to compare the degree to which each scenario, each bundle of policies performed. How did it perform with respect to the goal? Ultimately, well, let me start with what the no project alternative is. Environmental impact review processes such as this required mean that you have to have a base of comparison to compare the other alternatives to. And the base of comparison is, in this case, trends that are in progress already and policies that are already in place. So it's not as though the world suddenly stops moving, but rather that the current patterns and trends continue. And so you see here that the no project alternative, as it's called, falls well short of the greenhouse gas emission target of 15% reduction by 2020, I believe that particular outcome was. And then the preferred alternative that was ultimately adopted exceeded that particular target. And you can see that other alternatives that were created both by the planning agencies and interestingly in this case, the last 2 alternatives were actually created by different kinds of advocacy groups that got together and got involved in the process. So the Network of Communities alternative was led by the Building Industry Association that wanted to see less regulation, more housing development, and especially in the suburban areas. And the Equity, Environment, and Jobs Coalition was advocates for affordable housing, advocates for transit, advocates for protecting the environment that got together and created an alternative of their own. And it performed actually almost as well as the finally adopted plan. Another way that the model systems were used to evaluate and support decision making was through project-specific analysis. So if you think of the regional transportation plan, it embodies hundreds of individual transport projects. Now, take each one of those projects, a new rail station or change in service or congestion pricing, and evaluate it holding everything else constant. That's what this exercise was about. So this is hundreds of simulation runs, isolating each individual project and evaluating how well does it do in terms of how much it costs versus how much benefit it generates. So a traditional cost-benefit calculation. And then given those benchmarks and goals that I talked about earlier, does it help the region move in the direction that it wants to go in terms of meeting those goals? So you can see things like congestion pricing, both improving the goals that the region has and being highly cost effective, whereas things like highway expansion here are somewhat cost effective, not very high, but somewhat, but they actually move a little bit away from some of the region's goals, in part because, again, vehicle miles traveled is targeted for reduction. Okay? So I'm going to start turning attention to visualization work here. What we've done is try to create a platform for visualizing all this simulation work in ways that are legible to people that are not planners. Planners often talk in jargon like floor area ratios and things like that, that most people have no concept what they are talking about. And so what we've done is just create a visual way to look at different scenarios that have been simulated and look at how does that look in context? How much development are we looking at in different parts of the region? How intense is that development? What does it look like in context? And I think that started to make this much more accessible to a broader audience and let them participate more actively in the process. But again, the planning that's been going on is, I think it would be appropriate to describe it as aspirational. It's a bit of wishful thinking. There are good ideas in this, but it's unclear how realistic some of this is. And in order to actualize, realize some of these planning ideas, quite a few challenges have to be dealt with. Regional allocations of growth into these priority development areas have to be reconciled with what the cities are willing to do. What kinds of policies are they willing to enact in those areas? And will the market actually support that? You know, is it realistic from a market perspective? So are the affordable targets for affordable housing targets allocated different parts of the region also feasible? There's increasing concern about this question right here. We're focusing all this development around transit and creating amenity value from that. People value that accessibility. They're willing to pay more for it. And so that's going to have upward pressure on rents and prices. Similarly, if cities upzone, they allow more density to be developed around transit, that gives a windfall to property owners that own the land, making development more expensive. So you're likely to see more condominiums, more offices, less mixed income housing emerge around these transit nodes, which may undermine some of the goals of the planning process. All right? So what we're trying to do at this point is respond to some of these challenges with some additional innovation in the technology that we've been building and addressing some gaps. So some of the things that I'll talk about in the next few minutes are trying to create a data infrastructure to support ongoing planning. It's amazingly difficult. Even though we're drowning in data that's coming in from all sorts of sources, it's not necessarily always exactly the data we need. And so we're having to find ways to be more creative about fusing data, creating incentives for data sharing, taking data that's in data silos and making it more broadly available. I think 3D visualization is actually a pretty powerful tool for communication, and I think we're finding that it's bridging some gaps and starting to become much more helpful. Regarding participation, though, the way public participation in planning tends to work is it's too little too late. That is, I showed 5 scenarios that were generated by the regional planning agencies here. Why wasn't that 2,500? Why wasn't it done early in the process with lots and lots of people participating in contributing their own ideas about what would be good for their communities and how that fits within the regional objectives and goals. That's the direction I think we need to go, is finding ways to be more inclusive in the planning process and provide technology that makes it possible for people to do that, to actually create alternatives, analyze them on the cloud, and visualize them, and try to build support for it. So we've been building a platform called Urban Canvas for facilitating a good number of these objectives. The regional data that we want to start with as a kind of core foundational set of layers involves representing the built environment and what's happening to it. Land ownership parcels they're generated by public agencies, but if you go to, say, Orange County in California and ask for a digital map of the parcels, I don't know if they still do this, but until recently they've charged or asked $300,000 for a copy of a digital map that's been already funded by the public. They claim it's cost recovery, but I think that's dubious. I think parcel data has become recognized by state legal action as public record, so these things may start to change. And certainly local governments have, like San Francisco, New York, the state of Massachusetts have started to embrace open data initiatives and to start making more of their data readily available through APIs. But this is still slow, and I think we need to find ways to incentivize it and really make that snowball quickly. How many of you are familiar with OpenStreetMap? Most people? So it's a crowdsourced map. And I think what we need to do is find ways to create a counterpart of OpenStreetMap for all the built environment data in cities. We've talked with the OpenStreetMap people about doing this in the OpenStreetMap framework, and they're not keen to do it because this requires bulk uploading of data like parcel maps that doesn't fit into the OpenStreetMap ecosystem very well. And it's not immediately verifiable from aerial photography, which is, again, part of the OpenStreetMap ecosystem and approach. So I think it's going to need to have a parallel approach, and we're working on doing that now. But what happens when you can fuse all that data together and rapidly visualize it is it becomes comprehensible in ways that it isn't by looking at just massive amounts of data in tabular and other forms. This is just panning over Manhattan, looking at the synthetically generated representation, in this case just extruded building footprints, with color coding representing land use using this platform that we built. One of the other things that we're doing to try to make the visualization more legible, if you will, to people is on the fly creating building geometries for buildings that are representative, if not exactly what the buildings look like. So we're encoding architectural grammars in algorithms that allow us to rapidly associate a set of attributes on the parcel table about what type of building it is with the geometry of the parcel, and if we have it, the geometry of the building footprint, to rapidly generate a representation of that building in a way that's visually understandable or legible to people. So this is using CGA shape grammars, computer-generated architecture, as an algorithm to rapidly generate this kind of geometry on the fly to try to make these models much more reasonable and realistic. One just question I'll lob for people in this particular community to think about is if we have these procedural models that are forward procedural models that have some parameters that describe buildings, and if we could infer from, say, computer vision from Google Street Views or other data, what those parameters are, we might be able to actually create a very realistic representation of buildings with building attributes that are actually recognizable and not just a mesh 3D model. And I think that could be incredibly valuable, especially in areas that have relatively little data. Google Street Map may not be the right approach to take in trying to map out the slums in Nairobi, but there may be other data sources that would be available. And to give you a sense of where I think we're going to be going with this kind of technology is to take the kind of simulation work that we've been doing, bring it down to a very local scale to enable communities to interact with the city and with developers around what kind of development do they want in their community. And to look at how things like zoning and parking requirements and other sorts of factors that influence what can be done on a site, how that influences the financial viability of a project. So this kind of triangulated process of negotiation between cities, developers, and communities that often resist development that might be beneficial to the community in the long run, but for lack of information and maybe in some cases somewhat knee-jerk reaction to new development in their community, many of those things never materialize. And if we're going to tackle affordability problems in housing, we're going to have to find a way to get around that. I'm drawing pretty quickly to a close here. I think this is my next to last slide, just showing that one of the ways we want to advance this is, I don't know how many of you have gone to a public meeting at a city, a zoning meeting or something like that. It's kind of painful to go to these meetings. It's not done on a schedule that's conducive. You have a short little period to make a comment, and it's just not very meaningful engagement. What if people could engage offline, could work from home, could work from their office, and make comments or contribute to the formation of plans in a much more democratic way, basically, much more decentralized and asynchronous way in this particular case. I think that could really start to make participation much more meaningful in the planning process. So we're exploring at this point ways of facilitating simultaneous editing and collaboration, which could be done in a workshop, it could be done offline or asynchronously with people working on their own. And so I'll just conclude now with some things that we're currently focusing on and where the research is going, and then I'll open it up for some Q&A. As I've already mentioned, we're doing a lot of work right now on trying to understand housing affordability, how it changes. The growth of the tech sector here in the Bay Area has led to some interesting controversies, if you will, around Google buses and whether that's driving up rents and prices in certain parts of San Francisco. Certainly the tech sector has brought quite a bit of new income into the region and helped to inflate housing costs in an already expensive region. But that's not the only reason. We have lots of reasons, including restrictions on development that make it really difficult to build new housing. And we need to find ways to analyze the whole set of factors that affect housing affordability and to create ways to explore that space and find some ways to mitigate some of these challenges. We're beginning to try to automate much more the process of acquiring data, processing it, fusing it, imputing missing data, and then building these models in a way that can auto-calibrate and then be simulated on the cloud using a web interface to visualize the results. We're starting to mine much more heavily volunteer geographic information, or VGI. I mentioned earlier that we've been scraping Craigslist to get rental listings and look at that. PadMapper is another source that we can use for that. And we may start building or leveraging apps that have already been built and further extending them to try to probe and track people's housing search and mobility behavior to better understand the trade-offs that people make in that process and how different kinds of planning options might influence them. We're also starting to collaborate with the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Tianzhen, where are you? Right there, is going to be giving a talk later this afternoon on some of the energy modeling that's going on in the lab. And we're trying to find ways to integrate that with these urban scale simulations so we can start exploring how we can reduce energy consumption and make cities more sustainable from an energy perspective. And then finally, just really a plea for more collaboration in this community, trying to leverage machine learning techniques, data mining techniques, to solve many of the technical problems that we encounter in a very challenging, but I think really quite important space that we're working in. So with that, I'll conclude and open it up for questions. I haven't been monitoring time carefully, so how are we doing?